Obviously this is an image of my desktop for this morning, and I'm going to use it to perform one of the series, in the collection or the archive of this particular channel is called the desktop ekphrasis and ekphrases, and these pieces are responses to whatever image is generated for a particular day on the desktop, and because they're usually performed, at least with some element of language and speech, I'm allowing myself to refer to them in a way that relates to, at least obscurely, to the etymology of the word ekphrasis, and they relate to these images in various ways, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes allegorically, sometimes conceptually, and sometimes more directly and transparently. And I want to use this image to talk about aesthetics and semiotics, which those familiar with my discussions will be aware. Those are two areas that I'm very fond of talking about, and I'll begin though with some connections, personal connections I made with this image. The first thing that it reminded me of is after my mother died, she had requested that the way that she would like to return to the universe was that she would like to be cremated, and then she wanted her ashes to be returned to the sea, and she designated a couple of different places where this return might take place, and I chose the Pacific Ocean at a point called Torrey Pines, which is a state park, and there are walking trails. And when I lived in La Jolla and was going to UCSD, I used to run up to Torrey Pines, and then I would enter that park at a point called the Broken Hill Trail, and then I would run down to the beach, and then I would run back along the beach past where the state park ends, then a beach called Black's Beach, which was a nude beach for some time is there, and they people used to like to sail people used to like to sail hang gliders in that area, so you'd often see this kind of beautiful kite-like mechanical bird in the sky overhead, and it's just a beautiful area, and then of course the sunset reminds me of the symbolic values of the setting sun in relationship to the passing of her life, and as a symbol of the passing of human life, and the stones various, sets of relationships with that, and that image of the golden beam of light on the water, to various aspects of the symbolism of light, from the rays of the sun, to Italo Calvino's take on this in the section of Mr. Palomar, his book Mr. Palomar, called The Sword of the Sun, and that beautiful description of the way that light follows the perceiving eye, as if the perceiving eye, were in some way the center of existence, and that perceptual phenomenon that belongs to that story, or that figure, right, that Wittgenstein uses when he expresses that anecdote about someone observing, well, it was probably because it looks so much like the Earth is the center of the universe, and it's the sun that is revolving around it, that human beings first formulated this notion of an Earth-centric universe. And Wittgenstein's response is, well, what would it have looked like if it was the other way around? And of course, the joke is it would have looked exactly the same way. So those were some, some memories that this image brought back, and then I had, I had considered, in looking at it, and wondered, is this an image of the sublime, or is this an image of of the beautiful? And I mean, there are a number of different ways, I suppose, you could look at it. If it were going to be an image of the beautiful, one would have to take into account the simplicity of the relationships between the colors. If one were to take in, consider it an image of the sublime, one would have to look at the depth of the image and what it seems to suggest about the notions of eternity and time. And then these little in this reef, this reef again, very much reminded me of the reefs that I had to walk onto and past, to when I swam out and released the ashes of my mother into the Pacific Ocean. The foreground, looks a lot like some of the areas in Torrey Pines and along that coastline in La Jolla, and so reminds me of that. But these little stone figures, or whatever they might be, or that are surrounded by these barnacles, and this kelp and sea moss, reminded me of this little stone that I had picked up yesterday while I was walking, and I picked it up, for a number of, I don't know if you can really see this. I need more light here. Maybe I can get some of the light from the sun over here. This strange, strangely configured stone, as you can see, it has a sort of larger dollop on the bottom and a smaller dollop on the top, and it vaguely will function as as a top, but not very well. This might remind someone of that object in the film Inception. Very quickly falls over. Not a very good top. I could retool it to make it a better top, but I prefer to leave it as it is. It reminded me in some ways of a representation of a Buddha, a very abstract Buddha, and it also reminded me of the representation of Shiva that's referred to as lingam, and the sort of phallic character that it has in that respect. And it also reminded me of this food that the Mennonites, my grandparents were, and my ancestry on my mother's side is from Mennonites. People might be more familiar with the term Amish, but my family wasn't traditional Amish. They were ordinary Mennonites, but they make this bun, which is composed of a little piece of dough on the bottom that is sort of flattened out, and then a little round dollop on the top, and these are called sweebucks. And it reminded me of that as well. But I also picked it up. I don't usually pick up stones, but I picked it up because I was very much interested in the balance, and also in the way that it looks like it could be a piece in some kind of game. And if you had enough of these, and if there isn't a game that it corresponds to, you could develop a game around these objects if you had enough of them. I don't know how many we would need to make a game. You could, if you had the creative imagination, you could make a game out of just one of them. But in any case, these stones reminded me of that as well. But I'm not going to talk about all of those, connective memories and other than to use them as an introduction. But what I really want to talk about is aesthetics and this question of the beautiful and the sublime. And then I want to move those questions of the beautiful and the sublime to questions of conceptual art, versus what might more conventionally be referred to as artifact art. But what I want to argue is that, and I'm moving towards this using this image. But what I want to argue is that the distinction between conceptual art and art that is based in an experience of in some way transparent perception. Like this work doesn't require any significant amount of contemplation, to realize, what it is, as opposed to if I say this is the Buddha, you have to do a bit of work to get there. If I say, this is a representation of the sunset, or perhaps it could be sunrise. It looks like sunset to me, but I suppose it could be sunrise. But one doesn't really have to do an awful lot. One of the reasons why I think that it's sunset and not a sunrise is that by the time that the sun gets in at this level in the sky in the morning, we've already passed that point of dawn in which light, and if you've ever experienced dawn, watch the dawn for a period of 2 hours when it's absolutely dark to the period in which it's absolutely light. You'll realize that there's a point at which a wave of light passes across the field of your vision and fills the world. And it's the same moment at which the birds typically get very excited and dance in joy for the return of the day, and there's a kind of a powerful feeling when this happens of beginning that has a kind of musical quality to it. And this image, doesn't participate in that. It doesn't participate in the anticipation of that moment, or it certainly hasn't reached that moment. And at this level of the appearance of the sun in the sky, we should have reached that moment already, right? And I guess you could argue that it's an overcast day, and this particular moment in the dawn, the light is influenced by that haze, and that shadow. But it doesn't look that way to me. It looks very much like that moment of shadowy folding or infolding that occurs at dusk when the sun is still visible and casts this light as a kind of a sword of the sun. In any case, what I want to get to is an argument that the distinction between conceptual and well, let's just call it non-conceptual art. I don't want to use the word representation, because conceptual art is clearly representational as well, and it's just representational in a different way. In fact, I find the term non-representational art not particularly useful, for the simple reason that you're always representing something, or the act of signification wouldn't exist, and then you couldn't call it art, so and you couldn't call it communication, because communication does the same thing. It always represents something. Now, it may not represent it in the way that we conventionally think about representation. So that's something that we have to become aware of. But what I want to argue is that that it's more appropriate, or it's more it's more psychologically relevant and semiotically relevant to think about the distinction between conceptual art and non-conceptual art, not as a distinction between the material and the immaterial, but as a distinction between a transparency of representation to the apparatus of perception versus a coded representation, or if not coded, at least oblique and requiring some cognitive effort on the part of the perceiving subject. And what I was getting at in these images is that this is transparently to the eye an image of an ocean or sea, and and stone formations and in this island-like or reef-like formation in this area, and these reefs in the foreground, and waves and the light of the sun, and some relationship to a particular time of day in which the sun is visible nearly at the edge of the horizon. And this, whether we take it as an image of the Buddha, or a top, or a piece of a game, or a lingam, right, is that requires a decoding, or an investigation, or some kind of cognitive effort on the part of the perceiver, right? Because what it really is, and it's not a Sweebach either. What it really is a stone. It's an unusually formed stone. But what made it interesting was the suggestion of all of these possibilities and potentialities of this stone representing, right? And the stone itself, can't be, said to be conceptual. It's no more a conceptual object, particularly before I picked it up and it was lying on the ground, than a leaf, or a lizard, or a spider, or a flower, or anything else, that I encountered on my walk. But it lent itself to the psychological potentialities, right, that conceptual art participates in, for me at least, easier or more compellingly than some other stone might have, for all of these reasons that I've discussed. And it even reminds me in a certain way of the gestures of Marcel Duchamp, in his presentation of the bicycle wheel on the stool as an artwork, or the urinal, or other examples of found art. And the reason that these examples of found art are conceptual are the same reasons that this stone lends itself to a conceptual reading, not by virtue of and sometimes I think a mistake is made in art history in talking about the characteristics of these objects as structural forms, as if the interest that, say, Alfred Stieglitz took in the various structures and forms of the objects that he photographed were the same motivating force in choosing these found objects, on the part of a conceptual artist like Marcel Duchamp, so that it was a sort of Cagean looking at the world, and Cage is conceptual in his own way, but I think for Duchamp there was a different motivation, and those motivations had to do with discourses around which art was situated and being resituated in his time, and those distinctions are important, for a number of reasons, and we'll try to draw some of them out in this discussion. But I want to this object here, unlike this object, is I think it's fairly safe to argue that this object is neither an example of the beautiful nor an example of the sublime, and And this image seems to participate in both domains, right? The relationship, and maybe this would be an example of I've talked about this category before, the charming, and the charming is a category that, as far as I know, emerges in the discussion of the beautiful and the sublime in Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment. And if it emerges in the theory of aesthetics and art earlier than that, I'm not aware of it. But in the critique of judgment, as I can't remember if it's as Kant. I haven't had this volume for decades, probably over 20 years. I haven't had this volume, but in the critique of judgment, it may emerge as Kant is moving from his discussion of the beautiful to his discussion of the sublime, and figures as a transitional moment, or it may emerge, after the discussion of both of those. But he talks about the movement of flames in the fireplace, and the dance of these flames, and because the eye is his definition of the beautiful, you could say, emerges from Edmund Burke's discussion, but really transcends it. So for Burke, the beautiful is feminine, the sublime is masculine. He sets up these, sort of these binary these binary oppositions in a certain way. The beautiful is small. It reminds you, baby animals. The sublime is big, and all of these contrastive categories, that have to do with the materiality of the object as it's defined in this kind of pseudo-Aristotelian space and time, right? Whereas for Kant, like perception itself, and perception beyond merely the perception of the senses, but meaning perception, meaning that that how an object can or cannot be perceived. So for Kant, the beautiful is this compositional relationship of complexity to perceivability. This is a simple object, too simple for Kant to be an example of the beautiful. The beautiful has to be perceivable in a sense in one sitting, and a sitting could be defined as some transpired duration in space and time that doesn't exceed human limits and capacity to maintain comfort and stability, right? And so a kind of what would you call it? A psychological equilibrium, is established and maintained for a duration in which the articulation of all of the elements in the field of contemplation is graspable by the senses. Not necessarily immediately, but okay. So for example, let's go over here. If we were going to make an argument about whether this painting that I painted is beautiful or not, you would have to argue in Kantian terms that the relationship between all of the elements are a perceivable harmony. Perceivable, not conceptually perceivable, but perceivable to the eye, right? And you wouldn't perceive all of those relationships immediately, because even to see the detail, you have to move over here. But I painted this work across a limited duration, although it's long for some, but a period of 9 months it took me to paint this picture. And within that period of 9 months, I was able to conceive and perceive all of the relationships between the elements in the painting and their I hesitate to use the word harmony, but their how to put it, if I don't want to use the word harmony, the reason that I don't want to use it is it's a simplistic term that means really very little. It's one of those like terms that you fall back on when you really don't know what you're talking about. But what I'm trying to get at is that there is there is not a great degree of conflict in the way that these parts go here. For example, like this painting, suddenly there isn't a broken plate in the middle of the painting, and or suddenly there isn't a different relationship to dimensionality that moves into calls attention to the fact that the rest of the work seems to be flat, or suddenly there isn't a large space in which an emptiness opens up and in this otherwise sort of or vacui presentation, or there aren't shapes that don't seem to fit in the overall orchestration of the mechanics. And like I said, it takes a while to perceive everything and its relationship to one another, but it is, I would argue, perceivable. Now, when I made this work, I wanted that challenge. I wanted the ambiguous figure of the sublime and the beautiful, because I think it approaches the point where that, and I'll just use the word, but whatever, harmony begins to be unperceivable, right, or imperceivable. If it were any more complex, say it were 3 times this complex, I think it would be, too difficult to grasp. And I wanted, when I created it, to situate it at the edge of the beautiful, where someone might argue, no, it's not beautiful anymore. It's too much. We like, maybe, we like this one better because we can still easily perceive all of the relationships of its elements to the totality of its whole. So for Kant, that was the model, and it's clearly different from what Edmund Burke is doing, and it's clearly more sophisticated, and then why we prefer it. And the sublime was something that couldn't be perceived, right? But that existed beyond the merely perceivable as an image that the mind could make of what exceeded the limits of perception. So if we were to find in this image the sublime, we would almost have to move toward what it means as a symbol, what sunset means as a symbol, or the fact that the sun rises every day, right? And the eternity that's represented in light. And if we were to find, an example of the sublime in this image, we would have to focus on that part of the sea that's unrepresentable here, because it's so large, the ocean beyond. That this is an image of the totality of and a wholeness that can't be represented within a single image. But we sense that it's there. We know that the ocean exceeds what we can perceive of as the horizon here, that it goes on and it becomes invisible. And in doing so, the sublime moves closer to conceptual art than the beautiful does. And I want to argue in a certain way that the relationship between the sublime and the conceptual are not that the sublime is an example of the conceptual. I think that would be a mistake, because I think that there's a way of perceiving light here, and I think there's a way of perceiving the vastness of the ocean here that is provided, non-conceptually or preconceptually to the senses by what this horizon represents, what the movement of these waters represent, what this light represents, and what time represents in this work, as we think about the time required, the microscopic time required to build a reef in comparison to the time to build an island of stones, and the time of universe that is represented by both dawn and dusk. But I think that but the work that Kant suggests, that's not there in Burke, right? For Burke, it's just really big. but the work that cognitive work and imagining, that Kant imagines, that the mind can have an idea, he says, of these things, but but they can't be presented to the eye or the ear or some other sense, in the strict sense of presentation, right? The presentation always lies elsewhere and beyond. And in conceptual art, it might not be beyond, but in a certain way, it always involves either an elsewhere or a code that requires a certain amount of work to get there. And I want to think about that in terms of Barnett Newman, and it would be useful, maybe to look at, some, and think about, some different Barnett Newmans in relationship to this. And before we look at them, I'll just, continue to focus on this image and talk about them. So my discussion of Barnett Newmans will depend on, a lot of things. And one of those things is, one's knowledge of what these objects that I'm going to talk about look like, and whether you can picture them in your mind. But I've already discussed, 2 series of paintings by Newman. I've discussed the one mints, and I've discussed the Stations of the Cross, of which there are 14 depictions. And in certain ways, these works are parallel. And one of the reasons maybe for going back to Barnett Newman is because I consider him a conceptual artist, and because Lyotard, and I believe it's the volume that's titled The Inhuman, but again, I haven't had that volume for decades, perhaps 20 years or more, and I'm not entirely certain. But there are a series of essays, and they fall within what I refer to as Lyotard's user-friendly mode, which is you don't have to be well versed in continental philosophy from whatever from Hegel to Derrida, to get these lectures, and he does a series of lectures in which he tries to argue that, you know, the postmodern is about a movement, or not movement, but is about a epistemological, you could say, shift away from constructions of the beautiful and toward, you know, constructions of the sublime. And I think that's an interesting argument. And one of the arguments that I've made against this argument is that it overlooks that category that often gets overlooked, which is the charming. And if you were to try to situate, you know, someone like Gertrude Stein into modernism or the construct of postmodernism, it would be very hard to argue that any of her work represents, you know, an aspect of the sublime, right? And it would, but I think it would be equally difficult, other than perhaps, you know, in Tender Buttons. In Tender Buttons, you could make an argument for the beautiful in the representations that exists of these objects, rooms, and other categories of existence that she organizes, you know, very discreetly and tidily as a kind of like phenomenology of linguo-perceptual dailiness, right? And in this this play that is both a play of language, a play of objects, and a play of uses and familiarities, right? It's an orchestration of a constant shifting back and forth between these values that makes it interesting. But the shifting is itself perceivable. So you might begin with a carafe, or that is a blind glass on the table, and become aware of the object as a perception, and one becomes aware in the observance of the object as a perception, a relationship, you know, to its forms, and what the symbolic values of those forms might represent in terms of the social experience of someone like Gertrude Stein, right? A woman with a particular sexuality, and a particular set of interests in social experiences and forms and aesthetic modalities that, you know, that include, right, sculpture and painting and food and the organization and placement of household objects. And then, you know, then one might shift in one's perception of what's going on in the piece to an understanding of the play of language itself, and the sounds of language, and the references in language, and the syntax and the movement of meter, and the relationship between you know, utterance and silence, you know, meaning, you know, very subtly in the way that either the utterance becomes a string of run-on sentences or an abbreviated form of a sentence in which syntax itself is exposed, you know, to the process of aporia and just like the referential level of the language is as well. And so, you know, part of that play, and then the play of the symbolism and the representation. Well, are we really talking about, you know, just a carafe? And doesn't, you know, the idea of the blindness of it, because we perceive it, but it doesn't perceive us, bring us back, you know, as we contemplate the symbolic values and the relationship between the different elements of the reference to perception itself. So all of that going on, and I think you could make a case there for of Stein's work as an example of the beautiful, but very often you know, one can't, and it seems to me that you know, someone like Lyotard, you know, needs to account for someone as important as Gertrude Stein in modernism and in his continuation, you know, of the relationships between, modernism and postmodernism, right? Because in that respect, Stein is an early example of the postmodern, and we might not be able to say that of Frost, but we need to be able to say that of Stein. So or we might not even be able to say that of Williams, right? Like, the difference between Stein and Williams is, in a certain sense, vast, because Williams, although the apparatus of calling attention, right, to the structures of language are there in the same ways that they're there in all poetry. All poetry is, in a certain sense, right, calls attention to itself as a language, whether that's using meter or rhyme or whatever else it is, and yet it does so in this kind of like suspended disbelief way, right? Like Frost will never break out and says, "You remember that I'm writing all of this, right?" Like and Williams does the same thing with the Red Wheelbarrow, which is highly structured in terms of like choices in language and the way that words are organized into stanzas and those and syllabics and color choices, and it's very painterly, but just like a painterly image in early modernism that retains, right, this relationship between eye and window on the world. It never breaks character and talks about the fact that, well, there really wasn't a wheelbarrow, or strategizes around the process of how did you decide that it was going to be a wheelbarrow and not a shovel that so much depends on, right? Whereas Stein is always like taking those kinds of moves, and so hence I think not just quantitative differences in the way that the eye and the mind fall back upon the perceiving and the investigating, but qualitative differences as well. Okay. So that was one of my critiques of the Lyotard. You have to take into account someone like Stein, and one of the ways that you can do that is by reintroducing this concept of the charming. But this piece isn't going to be about the charming. What I'm trying to talk about and move toward is a relationship between these categories of the beautiful and the sublime and the conceptual so in going back to Barnett Newman, Lyotard takes up, and I believe that the figures that he takes up are the broken odalisks, although he may take up the one-ments in this series as well. Did I say broken odalisks? Because it's clearly not broken odalisks, and that would be an example of parapraxia, not dyspraxia. But if I said broken odalisks, that's a mistake. And of course, what I meant to say was broken obelisks. Now, I agree with Lyotard that Barnett Newman's broken obelisks are examples of the sublime, but for perhaps different reasons than they're taken by Barnett Newman, and those reasons involve my understanding of what conceptual art is, and this is going to take a long time to unpack. But let's go back first to why I believe that that the other pieces that we've looked at briefly or talked about briefly by Barnett Newman are examples of the sublime and not the beautiful. And so let's look at, or talk about the one-ments first, and the fact that Barnett Newman begun these one-ments in, I believe it was 1948, And I've argued that the one-ments and their etymological origins of the title in the word atonement, relate to the Nuremberg trials, and it's largely in relationship to the relationship between that title and the gesture of the one-ments as atonements, and the picture of the incomprehensible destruction of the Holocaust, and the impossibility of writing that kind of human destruction with whatever trial one could have, and which is not to say that the trials weren't necessary or psychologically important, but there's a sense in which beyond a certain level of horror, there's no going back. Whatever the results of those trials and the attempt of containment of the psychological experience, one can never return to the place of wholeness. And I believe that all of that is present in the pieces that Barnett Newman created around this centrifuge of the idea of atonement, and even in the way that the etymological origin of atonement is beyond, right, the word as it exists in the English language, and one has to reach for, like in the same way that one has to reach for the vastness of the ocean beyond the horizon, like to get meaning, one has to do that conceptual work, and all of that to me, that connection to the sublime is precisely what makes Newman's work an example of the sublime, but only through the conceptual, right? We can't say that there's anything in the painting itself that speaks of these things. In a way, Newman is the perfect embodiment of what Adorno said about the Holocaust, that after the Holocaust, poetry is impossible. But perhaps it wasn't that poetry was impossible, but poetry as the beautiful, or poetry as something that can perceive directly a window onto the world, a poetry of imagism, a poetry of transparency, a poetry of direct speech, a poetry without code, in effect, a non-conceptual poetry, cannot speak of this precisely because it can't imagine, what exists beyond the horizon, or what I have said, how is the Sabbath now a day, ever to be a day of rest again after the Holocaust? This is a question that I've asked in relationship to Newman. And Newman doesn't, specifically state that in any. I don't think that it's a performative utterance made on the part of the paintings, but I think an idea like that is hinted at. And if the seventh day and the Sabbath is to be in some ways an analog with that moment of rest and the perceiving of the beauty of creation once it was created, and God took a moment and looked back upon his work, the way that an artist will look at his work when he's finished, and evaluate it and perceive with pride the beauty in it. How is this possible after a destruction? Because the very idea of creation and the continuity of perception is broken, right? By this. Okay, so that was my take, and we're getting we're getting into this difficult area where we're exceeding the limit of an hour, and I won't be able to get this up on YouTube, and I haven't even really gotten where I wanted to get to yet. So we'll probably have to break this up into several pieces. But that was one of my takes on the one-mans and the relationship, to the moment in which they were conceived and the work began on the one-mans is very important to this argument. And then in looking at and I'll discuss that only briefly, but in looking at the Stations of the Cross, I have a similar argument, and it plays in some way on the subtitle, right, of that work, which is Lord, why have you forsaken me? And the subtitle in the Stations of the Cross place it in a particular moment, in relationship to those stations. In other words, you could say that as a caption, the subtitle foregrounds a particular moment in those stations in which, on the cross, the historical character of Christ cries out, to God, how can this be happening to me? And that moment, which itself is a quotation from one of the verses from the Psalms, is already inscribed in Jewish history, and so being taken from the Psalms of David, this figure of Christ on the cross, recognizing his continuity with the cries, that have come before him. Barnett, Newman's adaptation of the cry, which is already a quotation, right? When Christ utters it, and we know that the context is Christ's utterance because of the larger framework of the title which precedes the subtitle, the Stations of the Cross. There are no Stations of the Cross that relate to the Psalms. But the movement becomes almost dialectical in the movement of suffering, from the suffering of David to the suffering of Christ, back to the suffering of the Jewish people as a community and as a whole, in a historical reality that is still experiencing the devastation of this terror as an inexplicable and inexpressible trauma, from which this moment of the utterance itself, seems to take on, one could say, the value of eternity. In other words, there are moments of terror in which part of the terror belongs to the feeling that the terror will never end. And anyone who's ever been tortured understands this moment. The real horror in the moment is that the terror that one is experiencing is the terror of eternity, and in a certain sense, it is. And even Freud had this insight that there are certain moments that one returns to and repeats, and the eternal return, or the experience from which there is no return, and here that becomes that moment. Of utterance, through, I believe, the rhetorical strategies of, that are initiated in the gospel, when it becomes a quotation. Because you could ask the same question of the Creator without quoting a holy text, right? From the depths, you could ask this question. Oscar Wilde could ask this question. But when Christ asks it, he asks it in the form of this line from the Psalms. And when Barnett Newman asks it, he asks it in the form of this line from the Psalms and this line repeated by Christ. And so history, takes on the terms of unbearable trauma. And I'm going to return to the image. All I have to do is wiggle my cursor there, and we're back. But I want to move now to a discussion of broken of broken obelisks, so that we don't repeat the parapraxia that I believe that I uttered earlier. But in order to do so, I have to start a new piece, and we may change desktop images for that, and I have to begin formulating a relationship between the form, the materiality, and what lies beyond the form as conception. In order to make my point about conceptual art and its relationship to Sublime, and in a certain sense, code, and what a broken obelisk might mean. And just like in the one-mans, where we had to retrieve the etonym, and meaning of atonement, I'm going to argue that in the broken obelisks, we have to retrieve the meaning. Not only the Greek term obelisk, we have to retrieve, which means in some sense like a spit, or post, right? But that obelisks, and clearly it's the shape and stone of the obelisk that Newman is referring to. We're not called obelisks, by the Egyptians, but we're called tekhenu, and tekhenu. The etymological meaning of tekhenu is very, and the original symbolism is very different from what is available in the term obelisk. Again, there's the parapraxia, obelisk, and the idea of what's broken. And in order to recover and see the conceptual distance in what's perceivable and what remains imperceivable, we already have to make something of how an obelisk can be broken. Not only how it can be situated upside down on a pyramid, but how the meaning behind the word obelisk and the object obelisk is already lost, and what that brokenness might mean. And so in the next piece, I want to recover those terms, tekhenu and its symbolic function, and its function as a representation of a ray of sunlight, right? Because these obelisks that were never obelisks, the Greeks observed them, but were tekhenu. And the etymological significance of tekhenu, the Egyptian word, if you look it up on the internet, the internet provides something like sky piercer, but that's not really very accurate representation of the idea that the Egyptians had for the tekhenu, because the tekhenu was a representation of the sun god Ra or Re, and Ra was perceived as this beam or shaft of light, and in Akhenaten's time, when the Aten sun disk, and I have an image of this in one of my paintings, but when the Aten sun disk became the central conception of the idea of a monotheism, these shafts of light, that one can see, sometimes when there's an obstacle, like a tree or the horizon itself, you can kind of perceive like the hint of these like multiple shafts of light within this singular sword of the sun, right? If they're probably not perceivable in the image that you can see looking at this picture, but I can see them in more detail. But I'll provide them more clearly in an example from one of my paintings, and then we'll close and we'll begin elsewhere. But in this painting, you can see them, and the real etymology and symbolic function of the tekhenu. Okay, what I was saying about the time of monotheism in Egypt under Akhenaten was that the Aten, or the sun disk, was seen as the source of both eternal oneness and life, and hence the figuration of these ankhs at the ends of these solar shafts or tekhenu here, right? And so that etymology is probably better than the one that's provided elsewhere as sky piercer, which I'm really not sure what that means. It seems to be more a reference to the Greek term obelisk than anything else. But if you look up the actual hieroglyph itself, this is the image here, and you can actually see that there's a pictorial description of an obelisk itself in the configuration of the hieroglyph. Now that obelisk there, right? So that little candle-like looking thing that is the obelisk is what's referred to as a determinative. And what a determinative is that, okay, so say this were English, and then you would have the wave, and you have this representation of the mound and the other figure that exists as a word formation, right? And in order to distinguish, say, the word, let's just, like, I'm trying to think of a word in English that's spelled in the same way that it might be. Okay, so in order to distinguish the word, what's a word that's spelled exactly in the same way in English? Okay, here's one, orange. So in order to distinguish the word orange, as in citrus fruit, from orange as in color, you would have a determinant. And then, maybe the determinant in the word, the difference between the word orange and orange would be, you know, a little representation of an orange. So that's what the obelisk is situated as here. But as a pun, you know, you could say that the word obelisk, tekenu, in ancient Egyptian, you know, puns with to beat a drum, which is kind of interesting, you know, but may not have much to do with its actual etymological meaning, right? Because we have puns, and to do an etymology based on homology or homophagy, you know. Anyway, to do an etymology based on sound is generally what, you know, individuals in the field refer to as, you know, false etymology. But it's interesting, you know, nevertheless. But what we can say, you know, okay, so here's drum beat, musician with instrument, also related to, and then there's the determinant, and all right. Well, this is interesting. So the red in that is part of one of the ways of formulating this word. You know, may again refer back to, you know, the red color of the sun, or its relationship to symbolic relationship to the figure of Ra, the Egyptian, the early, you know, version of Egyptian sun god and his, you know, three forms, the three forms of Ra, and as well as, you know, to later, you know, what became of this image as an image of you know, shaft of light, and what it would, you know, mean for such a thing, you know, not only to be made of stone, but to speak of light, you know, and so already there's a relationship between these two forms that you know, express this gap, or, you know, or aporia of representational logic, that a stone, the very thing that seems to embody this idea of materiality, you know, to the greatest extent, is used as a representation and communication with the idea of this image of light, and then, you know, what it means for that to be broken in the Newman, you know, becomes one of the central, you know, points of our discussion. What it means for that communication of materiality of stone and light, and the communication of symbolism, you know, between them to be broken and situated, you know, in this new relationship, right, to the idea of the pyramid, which is not a teken or tekenu, but rather there's a different word for that, and that word it remains outside of the representation in the descriptive aspect of the piece in Newman, right? It's not broken obelisk on pyramid, but the pyramid is clearly represented. So again, you know, the aporia and the unspoken, the unnamed one that exists there, and yet, you know, it's clearly. And because it's clearly visible and it's unnamed, you know, we can call it, I suppose, you know, whatever we like. In English, we're going to identify it as a pyramid, but in ancient Egyptian, it was, the word is mir or mire, and it's related to this other word, primeval mound. And what's interesting about this word is that it has no determinant. It means itself. So
there's no etymological origin for mir. It exists as initially as a reference to these mounds or these pyramids, and in that sense, one needn't look further. In that sense, the word itself is primeval or primordial as an idonym. In the way that one imagines a mound to be, and so the connection of mound burial as passing, and mound as origin, or you even think of Wallace Stevens. I placed a jar in Tennessee. I mean, this idea of the primeval mound is intuit in the poem, right? And all seem to be, around, order was established around it, right? And this exists profoundly in this word, that even though it can be named, and one can look for source and pre-meaning in it, right? Like house of the soul or whatever. But all of those ideas that belong to the Egyptian word, for temple, are not present in this particular phonological construct, and that in and of itself is interesting, and may or may not contribute to the fact of why this primordial mound and its representation as in the form of the geometric figure that we refer to as the pyramid is not referenced in the title of the Newman piece. But even before we've really done much work and before we've completely arrived at the image of the broken obelisk, you can see that a great deal of its strategies of representation have to do with things that are not present but spoken of within the construction of the image and its relationship to the words that define that image.